Thank you so much. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to my talk. My name's Grace. I'm really excited to talk to you around our work all around benchmarking domestic energy using high resolution data and unsupervised clustering. So quick introduction, I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I'm part of the Applied AI for Environmental Risk CDT, and my research is really motivated by using machine learning methods to decarbonize the building stock. So Mario actually beat me to it with this visualization, but great minds and all that. So kind of broad motivations. Obviously, you all know how much energy buildings take up. And given that we're in this situation where in the last kind of 10 years, we actually haven't really been seeing that reduction. We've actually seen a small increase in building emissions. And we really need to be getting ourselves down to that 2030 scenario to stay on track for net zero. For the UK specifically, we have a very different housing stock to some of the other kind of papers here. I was really interested to see the comments on Hong Kong's building stock earlier, because the UK could not be more different. We have a very old building stock, some of the oldest in Europe. We have over 36% of buildings were built before 1945. So that's before a lot of the kind of energy efficiency regulation came into play. We also have a very drafty building stock, so some analysis has showed that the UK is among the worst for losing heat loss from our buildings. I'm sure anyone who's visited the UK can attest to how drafty some of our houses are. And so that kind of combination of an old building stock and a drafty one, given the situation we're in, where not only do we want to reduce operational emissions, we also want to prevent more embodied emissions. So we really don't want to be just tearing down these buildings. We want to be retrofitting them, and we want to be targeting more of those behavioural interventions. So that brings me on to my research question for this piece of work. Can we use big data to provide localised energy use benchmarks at a national scale? So big data, this work really relies on the big building stocks that are available for the UK and some really localised energy use data. Localised energy use benchmarks. We choose to use a clustering methodology in order to provide these customized benchmarks, taking into account specifics around your building stock, typology, age, and your socio-demographic profile, to provide more of a white box solution where you can understand exactly where these benchmarks are coming from. And national scales, well, it's a big problem. We really need to be doing this everywhere. Some sub-research questions. Where can we subsidize retrofit versus where can people potentially afford to pay? Where do we target behavioural interventions? And how does energy use vary across the country? Some prior works around benchmarking, specifically in the UK scenario, they're less granular than our work, so they look at kind of larger spatial areas and have more limited coverage, so potentially just looking at one city rather than a whole nation. So the methodology for our research questions, I'm going to be jumping into each of these individually, but broadly, we build two data stacks, one for our clustering and one for the energy use benchmarking kind of metric. We then run this unsupervised clustering at the city level, so we're looking at 111 towns and cities across England and Wales. Once we generate those clusters, we then provide an energy use benchmark per cluster based on the energy use stack that we've built. And then finally, I'll talk about how we can use this bottom-up methodology to target specific areas. So firstly, the clustering data stack. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. You can go to the paper to get the full method, but broadly, we generate city-level attributes relating to building stock typology, building stock age, and socio-demographics relating to average household size, ethnicity, and economic activity. The energy use data stack, this is, I would say, kind of the meat of the data processing we did. We derived energy use intensity that hopefully you're all familiar with from Mario's keynote. But in this case, we're looking at annual domestic gas consumption normalized by total building floor area. And instead of working at the building level, we're working at this small neighbourhood level or postcode level. So the postcode is a small geographic unit containing around 1 to 150 households. And we work at this level because that is the granularity of the energy data we have available. So the UK government published these subnational gas statistics, and we're using energy data from 2022 for domestic postcodes. Our normalizing factor, this is a variable that we derive, again, using a building stock data set. So for every postcode, we identify the shapefile for this postcode, and we then identify all of the buildings within the postcode. So we take all of the building footprints, we do both an ID match on the building and a spatial join, just to catch all of them. We then calculate per building the total building footprint, and then we aggregate that up for the postcode. And this is done for all of the postcodes across England and Wales that we can kind of match. The broad pipeline, we start with these 1.1 domestic postcodes for which we have gas data. When we first run our kind of building stock derivation algorithm, we get a 98% match for fully domestic and mixed use postcodes, so ones including commercial gas users as well. For this work, we then filter down to wholly domestic postcodes in order to match that gas data that we have. So we only have the domestic data at the postcode level. We then apply some other filters just to ensure a clean data sample, broadly some thresholds around total consumption, etc. And so this is what our data set looks like. We have 613,000 postcodes across England and Wales. Broadly, we're looking at around 9 to 28 buildings per postcode, looking at footprints, total floor area that ranges from 1,000 to 3,000 square foot. And we're looking at an EUI for gas between 64 and 93. So the first thing we wanted to do was compare this energy sample to existing works in the literature. So we firstly compare our benchmarks to some benchmarks published by CIBSE, that's the Chartered Institute for Building Survey Engineers. So this work was published in 2024, but contains gas data from 2016. And so our benchmarks sit quite a way below these published benchmarks. There are obviously some methodological differences. We're going at the postcode level, whereas this kind of cited work is working with a sample of houses in London. So they have 800,000 houses in London. And this actually comes from the UCL stock model, which is quite an extensive stock model that's been built up over many years. So three other factors that contribute to this difference: water level shift between 2016 and 2022. So we're looking at 17% reduction in total consumption, 18.5% when weather normalized. We also don't account for occupancy. We're just working with the published gas statistics. So obviously we don't take into account whether the postcode is fully occupied or not. And occupancy in England and Wales sits at between 5 and 7%. And London is also 13% higher in our data than the rest of the regions. So it's quite interesting to see a benchmark derived from London when our work actually shows us that London is actually a bit of an outlier within the UK. We're seeing a much higher gas EUI. Even taking those things into account, our benchmarks are still slightly lower. So we were quite gratified to discover some research published this September. So this work analysed an energy survey of around 4,000 houses for the UK for using energy data from 2019. And when we extracted an estimated gas EUI from their work, it sits really bang on our benchmarks, which was really encouraging. I was really pleased to see this. I was just a bit sad it came out too late to put in the paper. So on to the clustering. As mentioned, we use an unsupervised clustering method. We use spectral clustering, which is a graph-based method, which works really well for small data sets like this one, where we're clustering these 111 towns and cities. You can go to the paper for all the detail of the clustering, but broadly we did choose it over Gaussian mixture models, and we selected 8 clusters based on a selection of metrics and also the separation of gas EUI. So these are our clusters. We did some statistical testing to see the differences between them, and we find that we see the largest effect size between the top and the bottom cluster, as you may expect. So cluster 4 and cluster 7 are top and bottom performing clusters. So this is what the clusters look like. We're getting a little run through of some place names in the UK. So we have Plymouth, Swansea, Grimsby, Birkenhead in this cluster 4, this lowest cluster. And when we look at the kind of variable distributions of the clustering attributes, this cluster represents areas with high levels of economic activity, low levels of employment, and a high proportion of single-person households. And this, combined with the low gas EUI, makes us think this is an area at high risk for fuel poverty and places where we would potentially need to be subsidising retrofits for thermal comfort. Cluster 7, we see low levels of employment, a really high percentage of pre-1919 housing stock, so really old buildings, and this high gas EUI. And so here we think there's high chances of very low energy efficiency households and a good potential for energy savings were we to target these clusters with retrofits. So finally, onto the targeting. On the clustering piece, we did also identify some clusters that would maybe be good candidates for behavioural interventions, but you'll have to go to the paper to see all of the details of all of the clusters. So onto the targeting. Given this methodology where we work first at the postcode level, it means that we can go really granular in terms of our targeting. So now zooming in just to cluster 6, this top performing cluster in terms of their gas EUI, and looking at just the top 4 performers, we can again split out our postcode typologies, looking at postcodes with only a specific type of building. So here we see postcodes that are wholly terraces and postcodes that are wholly semi-detached and detached buildings. And here we see, even among these kind of high cluster mates, Bradford in particular, the terraces seem to be even higher than the semi-detached, even given this high EUI cluster and the top 4 kind of neighbours. So Bradford terraces, let's have a look at those. What we can do and what we see here is a satellite image of Bradford, and we have mapped all of the postcodes along with their typology percentage of terraces. So the red areas represent areas that are wholly terraces, and so when we zoom in, for those of you at all familiar with the UK housing stock, these really kind of straight uniform postcode shapes represent a kind of row of houses, two rows of houses either side of a street. And these will represent postcodes where all of the buildings were probably built together. So they're probably very uniform. And we know that these terraces have probably a very high gas EUI. We can also intersect this data with any of the other variables. So we could break this down by age. So we could intersect and say, where are the really old terraces, etc. We can also look at, say, the standard size houses. So those tend to be the kind of green areas in the suburbs where you have these larger kind of single family homes. So again, if we wanted to target those, we could look at those instead. And harking back to, I guess, something that was said earlier around application and impact, I mean, we would love to, involve local governments, retrofit professionals, kind of local decision makers, like get this data in front of them and help them to better target retrofits, behavioural interventions, and things like that. So just to wrap up, what have we done? We have generated our customised benchmarks for cities and towns in England and Wales. We've identified clusters at risk for fuel poverty, behavioural interventions, and targeted, subsidised retrofit. And this framework is very scalable, and it's able to add new data very easily. What's next? We want to extend the methodology to include some of the missing data pieces, potentially extend to look at time series energy data rather than just this snapshot. And we want to do a full scenario planning around how to retrofit in order to get the most emissions reduction for the least money. And I guess we'd also be interested in potentially trying to get this on a kind of website, get it in front of the individual homeowners to try and push for more gamified intervention so you can compare your performance to your neighbours and hopefully inspire, I guess, more individual action as well as more macroscopic action. Thank you very much. Happily accept feedback or questions.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was really interesting. I'll open up the floor first if anyone has a questions. I have a couple, but I'm gonna let people talk. Okay, Xiaomi.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very impressive benchmark, and I was curious about how, for example, for specific users, how can we customize the users, for example, downstream applications based on these macro results? Yeah.
For sure. So I guess the way I would see it would be some kind of map where we can overlay all the different data sources. So here we're just showing typology. We could instead show your variation from the benchmark. And ideally, we'd also want to allow them to do it against different subsets of data. So, if you have specific things you're interested in, you could compare your benchmark to, different kind of subsets of the data. This also deals a lot with some of the privacy issues with energy data. All of these postcodes will have at least 5 gas meters, so you don't have the problem of, invading people's privacy too much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Oh, over there. Oh, thank you. got it already.
Okay, so this is a nice work, but I'm wondering what exact difference you observe with this retro buildings and currently construction. So what are the real challenges you face?
Great question. I think some of the biggest challenges with these older buildings is, I guess each building is very unique. And so even though we are ideally looking for rows of houses, which are all very similar, there will still be internally, the older the house, the more variation internally there might be. So that's definitely a challenge. I think that's where involving the individuals in more detail and getting more information from the user would really benefit. So then we could potentially pull in, even if it's not your neighbour on your road that maybe has an extension, there might be another postcode, maybe in a different city, but maybe they have a similar internal makeup. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
We have time for a couple more questions from the crowd. Well, I have a follow-up in the meantime. Because if I understood correctly, this targeting, as you said, it's right now based on topology of the houses. But you mentioned something that perhaps later you could overlay the information of other data sources, such as the census data and stuff. So right now the targeting is not necessarily saying that this address this building because of these people live here. This type of demographic might be they might be more beneficial. You know, they might benefit more of a intervention now, even though the building might not be the worst cluster just yet, but the population residing there might need it sooner. Is that for future? Is it considered now?
Yes, so that is considered now to a certain extent. So we do include demographics in the clustering. And so I guess, yeah, that's when we kind of say, you know, we have this lowest gas consuming cluster, although from an energy perspective, that's quite good. You know, it's the lowest cluster, they've got low emissions. But given the demographic makeup of those towns, I guess we worry that that low gas EUI is coming more from like risks of underheating. And so that's potentially a target where we would almost want to increase their gas EUI in the short term for kind of like societal benefit, as well as maybe targeting retrofit. Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Any one more, perhaps? No? That's okay. We're just on time. So thank you so much. Great.
Thank you.